This presentation reviews some of the trends that have been noticed and also progress that has been made toward LGBTQ rights and equality in the continent of Asia. This is a vast territory, so there is quite a bit of diversity to be discussed as we do this. In spite of the diversity that we see as far as laws and societal acceptance of LGBTQ plus persons, the overwhelming consensus is that this is an area that has experienced the least development of rights for this group of individuals. And this is an image from Taiwan's recent celebration. In May of 2019, the country legalized same-sex marriage, and this is the first Southeast Asian country to do so. So because it's such a vast continent, you would expect to find some diversity. And indeed, you find quite a bit of diversity in cultural and religious influences, from Confucianism to Hinduism to indigenous religions to Christianity and Islam, as sort of the cultural shapers of ideology around the issue of homosexuality. But indeed, politics and society in all ways is influenced by these sort of philosophies and spiritual viewpoints. And the Asian continent also had varying experiences with colonization. Some countries were outright owned by other countries, as was the case of India and its colonization by Britain. But in the case of a country like Afghanistan, it was never formally colonized. And so the influences may be more direct or indirect historically, but the sort of overwhelming experience has been of outside colonization. And this has consequences for whether or not homosexuality was criminalized in the first place. As also and also whether or not countries resist sort of the modern day progress toward equality for LGBTQ plus persons. Another thing that complicates the vision of Asia and generalizing about Asian politics and also their status of LGBTQ rights is the status of democratization as well as economic development. Both of these are quite uneven, more so than they are in Africa and Latin America. Across this region, you see great diversity in terms of the expression of democracy. From, if you're looking at the map here, India has a fairly strong democracy. The green countries are democratic. And Southeast Asian countries, you generally only, you see the strongest democracy in Mongolia and India, but you generally find partly free and not free countries in that region. And then the map above, the Eurasian map, shows you that they're consisting of mostly not free and partly free countries. And this also has implications for the development of LGBTQ rights, of course. And so this is important for understanding the decisions that governments make related to how far they want to democratize, especially when their main goal is economic development. Some countries, the more modern countries like Hong Kong and Taiwan, South Korea, have had to make peace with the fact that because they are so international and they rely on resources from abroad, that they have had to sort of modernize their legal codes in order to really accommodate foreign businesses. And it's a very practical issue for a lot of these foreign businesses as well, because they don't want to send their LGBTQ plus employees to places where they'll be unsafe. So that sort of influence it's applied differently in different countries. In a place like South Korea, it's led to more liberalization. But that's certainly not necessarily the guaranteed case that if a country wants foreign direct investment, that it will become more LGBTQ plus friendly. But the pressure certainly is there, and the more democratic a country is, the more this push for LGBTQ rights is going to be seen. This graphic comes from Indepedia.com, and it just points out that the European countries really decriminalized homosexuality before, in some cases, before they ever made them illegal or criminalized them in their colonies. And in the case of these colonies listed here on the left, India has actually reversed its rule or its criminalization of homosexuality in the past year. So that is some progress. But they've gone back and forth about that issue. But again, this points to the influence of foreign countries and how they have sort of, instituted these oppressive policies that some of these countries are really struggling to let go of. Looking most closely here at Southeast and South Asia, there's an interesting breakdown in contrast, especially if you can compare to the country of Australia here, which is now recognizing same-sex marriages as of the 2018. And you see, again, some diversity from no penalization to the death penalty in Pakistan for same-sex practices. And so this is something that human rights activists and activists in these countries are certainly concerned about. Russia is considered both part of Europe and part of Asia. We often call that nebulous area Eurasia. And so it's really relevant to mention them here. And they have made the news in the past, 5 or 6 years by sort of issuing some of the more draconian and damaging laws against LGBTQ plus persons under the guise of anti-propaganda laws. It has been made illegal to display the pride flag in Russia in public. It has been made illegal for same-sex couples to engage in any kind of public display of affection, and discussion and teaching of LGBTQ plus issues can land a person in prison. In addition, the Russian government has been cracking down for about the past decade on any sort of human rights watch group or LGBTQ plus organization that has been formed outside of the country. So they maintain strict control over civil society organizations, and that has had a dampening effect on the LGBTQ plus community in that region. And going even further, you also have an increase in violence against LGBTQ plus persons. This is not uncommon. You see this taking place in places like Brazil and places in the United States, wherever you have any kind of vocal opposition by the leadership of a political party or a religious group that seems to encourage violence against this group. When you have legislation that kind of works against a group, or even just a lot of rhetoric, violence against them often increases. Another type of violence that's made possible by these laws, though, is state-sponsored violence. And since at least 2016, reports from Chechnya have been coming out that gay men specifically have been rounded up and subjected to humiliating torture and abuse in their communities, have often had, really negative responses. So they don't have any community or family support as a response to this. So this is an ongoing question when we discuss the universality of human rights. I know that one of your articles discusses that and how Confucianism may or may not work against that. But how universal human rights is up for debate, obviously, not just philosophically, but also in the sense of how universal are these rights in practice? Are countries legally working against them? And the United Nations has attempted to create offices specifically for the monitoring of LGBTQ rights. And this is part of sort of the human rights function of the United Nations. But a lot of countries in Asia, and even most recently the United States, have worked against what's known as the state sovereignty of a lot of these countries who want to criminalize, including instituting the death penalty, this behavior. So this is kind of the region now to watch, as we see both a lot of advances in terms of, maybe looking at Hong Kong and Taiwan and South Korea, Singapore and India perhaps as being a little bit more accepting and open to these rights, whereas these others severely lagging. But as always, I would expect for this progress to really depend on cultural acceptance. And much of Asia sees less than 40% of people who believe that homosexuality and gay marriage should always be allowed. So a lot of that's going to depend on, the public opinion, but it is also going to depend on religious influence and institutional democratic, if they, are trying to be a democratic country, then those institutions could help further LGBTQ rights. But in cases where countries are not democratic, minority rights tend to be not very highly respected. So these are really the three elements that you see coming up in the United States, but also in Africa and Latin America. Culture, religion, and democratic institutions always seem to count.